She mocked the myths of human warriors, until she witnessed one in battle. Part 1. The Ambassador's Disdain. Talvos had met many species in her 40 years as a diplomat. She had sat across tables from beings that breathed methane, beings that communicated through color changes in their skin, beings that had no mouths and spoke entirely through vibrations in the floor. She had seen species that arrived at the galactic community with their heads held high, and species that arrived trembling with wonder. She had, over 4 long decades, developed a very reliable sense of what a dangerous species looked like. Humans did not look dangerous. They looked soft. That was the first thing she noticed when the human delegation came through the docking corridor of Station Vale Dara. No natural armor, no claws, no venom, and no enhanced sensory organs. They walked upright on 2 legs, which was not unusual, but they did it with a kind of loose, easy confidence that she found oddly out of place. They were small by galactic standards. The tallest one in the group barely reached her shoulder. The lead diplomat was a man named Cole Harrington. He had a wrapped food item in one hand and a tablet in the other. He was reading and eating at the same time. He did not look up at the towering crystal architecture of the station. He did not slow down to take in the sweeping views of the star field through the panoramic windows. He just walked through like he was heading to a meeting in a building he had been to 100 times before. Talvos watched him from the end of the corridor and felt something she was not used to feeling in diplomatic work. And she felt mildly insulted. Station Vale Dara had been built over 300 years ago by the finest architects in the Varek Confederacy. Its reception hall alone had reduced ambassadors from 7 different species to tearful silence when they first walked in. The ceiling was 400 meters high, carved from a single piece of luminescent stone, and it shifted color with the movements of the stars outside. It was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most beautiful spaces in the explored galaxy. Cole Harrington finished his food, looked briefly for somewhere to throw away the wrapper, and asked a station attendant where the nearest waste receptacle was. Talvos walked forward and introduced herself. Cole shook her hand, a human greeting gesture involving direct physical contact, and which she found unnecessary but had been briefed on, and smiled at her. He had the kind of smile that came easily and meant nothing in particular. He told her to call him Cole and said her career was impressive. She was fairly sure he had read about her on the way in, which was either efficient or disrespectful, and she could not decide which. Over the next 3 days, they sat through the preliminary rounds of talks, trade agreements, territorial boundaries, resource access along the Sulari corridor, the usual architecture of diplomacy, careful and slow. Cole Harrington was, she had to admit, a competent diplomat. He was not easily rattled. He did not raise his voice. He made points clearly and then stopped talking, which was a rarer skill than most people realized. She found herself paying attention when he spoke, and even when she disagreed with him. But outside the formal sessions, she could not stop watching his species with something between curiosity and confusion. The humans in his delegation laughed too much. Not politely, not strategically. They laughed at things that were not particularly clever. One evening, she passed a corridor where 3 of them were sitting on the floor eating again, talking about some story involving a mechanical failure on a ship they had served on years ago. The story ended with all of them completely helpless with laughter. Whatever had happened seemed, by the telling, to have been genuinely dangerous. And yet, they were laughing about it. She filed this away without understanding it. She began, in the evenings, to read through the intelligence file the Varek Confederacy had compiled on human military history. The file was long, longer than she expected. It ran to over 9,000 pages, and that was only the summary document. The full archive was deep enough that she estimated it would take years to read completely. She skimmed it at first, the way she skimmed most species' military histories. All species had them. All species inflated them. It was a pattern she had seen so many times it had long since stopped interesting her. The Gorath claimed their ancient warriors once fought for 30 unbroken days without rest. The Seleni had a story about a single naval commander who held a blockade for an entire century through willpower alone. They were stories. They were what species told themselves to feel large in a big universe. The human file felt different, and it took her a while to understand why. It was not clean. Most species' military histories had a kind of polish to them, a shaping toward legend. The human file was messy. It was full of specific small details that nobody would bother to invent. Casualty reports written in dry, clinical language that listed not just numbers, but names. Personal letters from soldiers to family members back home, scanned and archived, full of ordinary things. Mentions of mud, of cold, of missing a particular kind of food, of worrying about a sibling's health. Maps with handwritten corrections in the margins. After-action reports that noted equipment failures, poor decisions, and moments where things nearly went completely wrong. It did not read like a legend. It read like something that had actually happened. She flagged it as high-interest material and set it aside to read properly later. She told herself it was still probably exaggerated. All military histories were. Humans were no different from any other species in their need to see themselves as warriors. On the final evening of the preliminary talks, there was a dinner hosted by the station. Talvos found herself seated near Cole Harrington by the arrangement of the seating chart, which she suspected was not accidental. The station staff had a fondness for what they called organic diplomacy, the kind that happened over food rather than across tables. Cole was eating again. She was beginning to think it was a constant state for his species. She asked him, carefully and without particular emphasis, what he thought of how his species was perceived by others in the galactic community. He considered the question with more seriousness than she expected. Depends who you ask, he said. Some species find us noisy. Some find us confusing. Some are nervous around us and don't really want to say why. And your military reputation? She asked. He looked at her with something quiet in his eyes. You think it's exaggerated, he said, not a question. She chose her words carefully. I think all species have a tendency to mythologize their own strength. Cole nodded slowly. He did not argue with her. He did not defend his species. He just poured himself more of that dark drink humans loved, and looked out the window at the stars, and said very quietly, Yeah, I've heard that before. She expected frustration from him. She expected pride, or at least a rebuttal. What she got was something that looked more like tiredness. Like someone who had tried to explain something important many times and had stopped expecting to be believed. That quiet look stayed with her. That night, in her quarters, she opened the human military file again. She started from the very first page this time. She read until the station lights shifted to their night cycle. She read until her eyes ached and the stars outside had rotated a full quarter turn. She still believed it was exaggerated. But for the first time, she was no longer entirely sure. She mocked the myths of human warriors until she witnessed one in battle, Part 2. The ship that felt like a living thing. 3 months after the diplomatic talks at Station Vael Dara came to a close, Talvos received a posting she had not asked for. The message from the Varek Confederacy's diplomatic office was polite and brief. Like the way messages containing assignments you are not going to enjoy always are. She was to serve as a joint observer aboard the human carrier vessel CNS Ardent Cross, deployed to the Solari Contested Zone for a period of no less than 4 months. Her role was to monitor, document, and report. She was not there to interfere. She was not there to advise. She was there to watch. She read the message twice. Then she packed her things. The Solari Contested Zone was not a glamorous assignment for anyone. It was a cluster of 11 star systems sitting at a crossroads between 4 different territorial claims, including the Varek Confederacy's own. For decades, it had been a place of low-level conflict, piracy, smuggling, and the kind of slow, grinding instability that never quite became a full war, but never quite stopped being dangerous either. And 2 smaller species were fighting over resource rights in the outer belt, and 3 larger powers kept that fight alive by quietly supplying both sides with just enough to keep going, but not enough to win. It was ugly work that nobody would ever write clean stories about. The Ardent Cross was waiting for her at Transit Station 4, and she saw it through the docking port window long before she reached the airlock. It was very large. She had been told human warships were large, but data and direct sight were different things. The Ardent Cross was a carrier-class vessel, which meant it was built to hold and launch smaller fighting craft from its interior bays. Its hull was dark, practical, and marked by the kind of wear that came from years of active deployment. She could see repair welds along the bow section from where she stood, thick and functional, the kind of repairs that got the ship back into service rather than the kind that made it look presentable. Someone had scratched a small drawing near the main airlock, a rough image of a bird with its wings spread, painted in white, slightly crooked. It looked, she thought, like a ship that worked for a living. The officer who met her at the airlock was Lieutenant Nina Caldwell. She was a young woman, compact and unhurried in her movements, with close-cropped dark hair and the kind of calm that Tel Voss had come to associate with people who had been in difficult situations enough times that they no longer felt the need to perform readiness. She simply was ready. There was a difference. Nina shook her hand, told her she'd show her to her quarters, and began walking without making a production of it. Tel Voss followed her through corridors that were clean and efficiently lit. The air recyclers gave everything a faint hum that sat just below the level of notice. Crew members passed them in both directions, moving with purpose. A few nodded at Tel Voss with the polite neutrality of people who were used to seeing unusual things on their ship and had no particular opinion about it. Her quarters were small but organized. There was a desk, a narrow bed, a viewport looking out on the star field, and a small shelf that someone had bolted to the wall at an angle that suggested it had been put up in a hurry and never corrected. It was not comfortable in any luxurious sense. It was functional. She found, to her mild surprise, that she did not mind. Captain Owen Reyes received her in his briefing room 30 minutes later. Oh, he was a man of middle years, gray at his temples, with the kind of stillness in his face that Tel Voss recognized as the result of long practice rather than natural temperament. He offered her tea before she had sat down, explained the ship's operating rules in 4 minutes without making them sound like rules, and told her that Lieutenant Caldwell would be her point of contact for anything she needed. Then he said he was glad to have her aboard and meant it in the plain way of someone who did not bother with things he did not mean. She was, despite herself, impressed. Over the following weeks, she began to observe the crew in earnest. The first thing she noticed was the noise. Not loud noise, not dangerous noise, but a constant low level of talking and laughter and movement that never fully stopped. In the mess hall, so crew members ate together in clusters that shifted and reformed depending on who was off shift, and conversations jumped between serious topics and complete nonsense without any obvious transition. She sat in the corner with her food on several occasions and simply listened, cataloging what she heard. On one afternoon, she heard the following things within a single hour: a detailed and clearly expert discussion of structural failure points in the ship's port stabilizer array, a debate about whether a particular card game was more about skill or luck, a story about someone's younger brother failing his driving test 3 times, and an argument about the correct internal temperature for cooking a piece of meat that somehow lasted 20 minutes and involved 4 people who all had strong opinions. She did not understand why any of it was interesting to them. She also could not stop listening. There was a weapons technician named Gary Okafor, who had apparently been telling the same joke for the better part of 3 years. She heard it for the first time in the hangar bay while he was running maintenance checks on a fighter craft. It was not a good joke. It involved a supply depot on a distant moon, a malfunctioning cargo loader, and a punchline that required you to understand a very specific kind of mechanical error to find funny. The two junior technicians working with him groaned in a way that was clearly rehearsed, then both of them smiled. Gary looked satisfied with himself in the way of a man who has found something reliable and sees no reason to change it. She filed a report noting that human crew cohesion appeared to depend heavily on shared repetition, predictable humor, and a general tolerance for sustained silliness. She described it as illogical, but apparently effective. Her superior sent back a single line acknowledging receipt of the report. As the weeks passed, she began to notice something else beneath all the noise and laughter and egg debates and card games. These people knew exactly what they were doing. She sat in on a tactical briefing and watched the crew officers break down a patrol corridor with a speed and precision that required no discussion of basics. They had all started from the same understanding without being told to. She watched the engineering team run a drill for a hull breach scenario and saw them move through it like they had done it 1,000 times. Because they had. She watched Nina Caldwell run a junior crew member through a navigation recalibration and realized that the lieutenant's unhurried manner was not slowness. She was simply so far ahead of the problem that there was no need to rush. Talvos began to revise her early assessment. She had arrived thinking she would be observing an ordinary warship with an inflated reputation. What she was actually observing was something she did not yet have the right words for. She thought about that a great deal in the evenings. She also thought about the 9,000-page file with its letters home full of mud and cold and ordinary worry. She thought about Cole Harrington and the tired look in his eyes when she told him she thought his species' military reputation was probably exaggerated. She was on the observation deck, thinking about exactly that, when the alert klaxons sounded. She gripped the rail and looked out the viewport and saw, far in the distance, the cold, bright bloom of weapons fire lighting up the dark, and the ardent cross. This scarred and humming and laughing and ordinary ship began to move. She mocked the myths of human warriors until she witnessed one in battle. Part 3. 47 seconds. The pirate fleet came out of a debris field. 7 ships, mid-class raiders, the kind that were cheap to run, hard to track, and maintained just well enough to keep flying. They had been hiding in the electromagnetic scatter of a broken asteroid cluster for what the Ardent Cross's sensors later estimated was about 6 hours, patient in the way that hungry things are patient, waiting for the right target to drift close enough. Yet the target they found was a convoy of Solari civilian transports, 3 cargo ships, and a small medical vessel moving through the outer corridor of the Solari zone under minimal escort. The raiders hit them fast, and from 3 directions, and by the time the convoy's own sensors registered what was happening, 2 of the cargo ships were already taking fire. Talvos was on the observation deck when the alert sounded. She had been reading, or trying to read, which was what she did when she was thinking about something else. Through the wide viewport in front of her, she could see the distant light of the engagement, far off and terrible and small, the way violence always looked from a distance. She stood up from her chair without knowing she was doing it. On the deck below, and she could see through the interior windows that the bridge had changed. The crew was already at stations, not rushing, not shouting, not the kind of noise she had always associated in her imagination with military emergency, just people moving precisely into the places they were supposed to be, with the smooth certainty of pieces fitting into a space they were made for. She checked the time. She kept checking it. 47 seconds after the alert sounded, she heard Captain Owen Reyes's voice come through the ship-wide communication system. His voice was calm. Not forced calm, not held together calm. Just calm, the way a man is calm when he is completely inside a task that he knows how to do. "Battle stations," he said. "All wings launch, weapons free on confirmed hostile targets. Let's go." The Ardent Cross accelerated. Nantelvos grabbed the observation rail with both hands. She was not prepared for the feeling of it. The ship was enormous, and enormous things were supposed to move with a kind of slow, heavy purpose. The Ardent Cross did not move that way. It moved the way a large predator moves, all that weight committed, no hesitation, the kind of speed that comes from everything working in the same direction at the same moment. The deck hummed beneath her feet. The star field outside the viewport shifted as the ship changed course. She could feel it in her chest. Nina Caldwell appeared at her side. She had a gift for that, appearing without warning, which Telvos had stopped being startled by 2 weeks in. "Ambassador," Nina said, "I need you to move to the secondary observation suite. It's shielded." "I want to see," Telvos said. Nina looked at her for one moment. It was not a long look. It was the look of someone making a quick and practical decision. "Then hold on to something and stay low if I tell you to." Talvos nodded and held on tighter to the rail. The fighter wings launched in sequence, and it was one of the strangest and most striking things she had ever seen. The bay doors opened in a rhythm she could feel in the hull, and the small craft came out in waves, 2 and 3 at a time, fast and tight, and absolutely controlled. They fanned out ahead of the carrier in a pattern that looked, from above, like something expanding outward from a single point, filling space with purpose. 24 fighters. She counted them without meaning to. The Raider fleet tried to respond. 2 of the 7 ships broke off from the convoy and moved to intercept. While attempting a flanking arc that was, she had to admit, tactically reasonable. It was the kind of move that would have worked against a heavier, slower vessel. It would have worked against almost anything she had ever seen. The Ardent Cross turned inside their arc. She watched it happen and did not fully believe it. The angles of the maneuver were wrong for a ship that size. The geometry of it defied what she understood about carrier-class mass and propulsion. And yet the ship completed the turn, and the 2 Raider vessels that had been trying to flank it found themselves suddenly on the wrong side of a very large number of weapons. Both ships were disabled within 40 seconds. The remaining 5 Raiders were still engaging the convoy, or trying to. The fighter wings had reached them by now. And the engagement that followed was not a battle in any sense she would have used the word. It was more like watching something get taken apart by people who knew exactly which pieces came off first. The fighters moved in groups of 3, one drawing attention while 2 closed in, switching roles in a rotation she could barely track. There was communication happening, she knew that, voices on channels she could not hear, but whatever was being said fast, and without excess. She could see it in how they moved, in how they responded to each other without gaps. One Raider tried to run. It broke away from the main group and pushed its engines hard, heading toward the edge of the debris field. 2 fighters peeled off from the group without being told to, or if they were told. The order was given before she could see it was needed. They caught the fleeing ship 2 minutes later at a position that suggested they had anticipated where it was going before it got there. The 7th Raider transmitted a surrender code. The whole engagement lasted 11 minutes. Telvos stood at the observation rail and did not move for a while after it was over. Her bioluminescent patterns, which her species could not fully control, were cycling through the colors that among the Varek indicated something between disorientation and the particular sensation of having to revise a belief that had felt settled. Below her, through the interior windows, she could see the bridge crew already moving into the next phase: damage assessments, communication with the convoy, coordination with the fighters returning to the bays. And the shift from combat to aftermath was immediate and smooth. No celebration, no visible relief. Gary Okafor, she could see at his station, was running post-engagement checks on his weapons systems and appeared to be humming something. She found Captain Reyes on the bridge 20 minutes later. He was reviewing a report, tea in hand. "How?" she said. She had not planned to open with that word. It came out anyway. He looked at her without surprise. "How what, Ambassador?" "The decision time," she said. "From the moment the alert sounded to the moment you gave the order. 47 seconds. That is not a normal response time for a vessel of this class. And the turn, the flanking interception, that should not have been physically possible at your mass." Reyes was quiet for a moment. He set down his tea. "We train for it," he said. "A lot. And the crew knows how to trust each other fast, so nobody is waiting on anyone else to be sure." "But the speed of the decision—" "We don't wait when people are dying," he said simply. She looked at him. He looked back. It was a short exchange, and it contained more information than most conversations she had in a full day. He offered her tea. This time she accepted without hesitation. She sat down across from him and wrapped both hands around the cup and let the warmth of it settle into her palms. And for a while neither of them said anything, and the ship hummed around them like a living thing that had just done what it was built to do and was already ready to do it again. She thought about 47 seconds. She thought about it for a long time. She mocked the myths of human warriors until she witnessed One in Battle Part 4, The Man Who Walked into the Fire. 2 weeks after the engagement with the pirate fleet, one of the disabled raider vessels was flagged for a boarding operation. The intelligence division on the Ardent Cross had identified the ship as a likely node in a larger supply network, the kind of operation that connected piracy to something more organized and more dangerous. There was data aboard that they wanted. A retrieval team was assembled, small, efficient, mostly automated drones for the scan work, with a human fire team along as backup in case things got complicated. The general expectation was that things would not get complicated. The raider ship had been disabled and boarded once already for a cursory check. It had been confirmed as carrying a skeleton crew of 4, all of whom had surrendered without resistance. Intelligence estimated the ship was effectively empty of threats. Intelligence was wrong. What they had not detected was a sealed compartment in the lower hull, insulated by a layer of interference plating that had scrambled the deep scans. In that compartment were 6 armed individuals in environmental suits, members of the raider network who had hidden themselves during the first boarding and waited. They were not there by accident. They had been left behind specifically for the second entry, the retrieval team, the people who came looking for information. Talvos was in the secondary command room when the operation began, which was not where she was supposed to be. She had found the room empty. He opened the door with the access code Nina had given her for emergency use, and settled in front of the monitoring screens. The secondary command room had a full relay of the fire team's helmet cameras, communications feeds, and a real-time map of the raider ship's interior. She had been watching for 20 minutes when Nina found her there. Nina stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at Talvos sitting in front of the screens with the focused attention of someone who had been reading for hours. Then she walked in, pulled up a chair beside her, and said nothing, which Talvos had come to understand was Nina's way of agreeing to something without making it official. The fire team was 6 people. Their team leader was a man named Corporal Danny Voss, in which was a coincidence of surnames that Talvos had noted with faint interest when she saw the team manifest. She had pulled up his personnel file out of habit. He was 23 years old. He had been born in a place called Tucson, a city in a dry, hot region of the human home continent. He liked fishing. His file listed a pet, a dog named Biscuit, in the personal information section. He had been in active service for 18 months. She looked at his face on the personnel photo. He looked young. He looked ordinary. The team entered the raider ship without incident. The drones spread out to run their data pulls. The fire team moved through the corridors in the quiet, professional way she had come to expect from the Ardent Cross crew checking corners. communicating in short clipped phrases that conveyed maximum information in minimum words. They were at the main junction corridor, halfway to the primary data core, when the hidden compartment opened. The 6 ambushers came out firing. 3 of the fire team went down in the first seconds. Not killed, the armor held, but hit, pinned, unable to move. 1 was caught in the left leg and could not walk. 1 had taken a hit to the shoulder that had disabled her weapon arm. 1 was pinned behind a collapsed piece of corridor wall, unhurt, but unable to reach the others without crossing open ground under direct fire. The remaining 3 members of the fire team, including Danny Voss, were cut off. A section of ceiling had come down in the firefight, blocking the corridor between them and their 3 downed teammates. And the only way back to the pinned members was through the junction, which was held by 4 of the 6 ambushers who had repositioned to cover it. On the screens, Tal Voss could see all of this at once from the overhead map. She could see the 3 downed teammates. She could see the timer on the bottom of the medical readout that showed how long a wounded soldier could safely wait for treatment. She could do the math. The 3 pinned members were going to die if nobody reached them in the next 90 seconds. She heard Danny Voss's voice on the comms. He said very quickly 2 short sentences to the other 2 team members beside him. She did not catch the words, but she saw what happened next on his helmet camera, and she understood. He pulled a piece of blown corridor plating off the floor. It was a rough slab of hull metal, and maybe a meter wide, torn free by the initial ceiling collapse. He lifted it in both hands. He turned toward the junction corridor, and he walked into it. Not ran, not charged. He walked, deliberately, holding the metal plate in front of him as a shield, moving at a pace that was controlled and purposeful, like a man crossing a room to close a window. The ambushers opened fire on him immediately. Tal Voss watched the impacts on the plate, sparks and heat blooms across the metal. 1 round caught the edge of the plate and deflected. Another hit his armor on the left side, and he stumbled half a step, caught himself, kept moving. A 3rd round found a gap at his shoulder, and she heard him make a sound over the comms. 1 sound, short and involuntary, barely a grunt, and the kind of sound a person makes when they do not mean to make any sound at all, but the body answers without permission. Then nothing. Just his breathing, which was steady, fast but steady. In through the nose, out through the mouth, regular as a metronome, a rhythm she would later learn humans trained themselves to maintain under exactly this kind of pressure. He covered the length of the junction corridor in the time it takes to breathe 4 times. He dropped the plate. His sidearm was already in his free hand, and in the space of 4 seconds, with the fluid efficiency of someone who has practiced the same sequence of movements until it lives in the muscles rather than the mind, he removed 2 of the 4 threats in the junction. The 3rd ambusher tried to retreat and was stopped. The 4th attempted to bring a weapon around and found, apparently, that Danny Voss was faster. Then he sat down against the wall. He applied a tourniquet to his shoulder with 1 hand, using the wall behind him for leverage, working with the same unhurried precision that Nina used for navigation problems and Gary Okafor used for weapons maintenance. When it was done, he checked it, adjusted it once, and spoke into his comms. "Junction's clear," he said. His voice was completely level. "Get the medic to Junction 7. Someone tell the captain the lower deck scans need recalibrating. There was a shielded compartment." Tal Voss sat in front of the screens in the secondary command room and did not move for a long time. Beside her, Nina was very quiet. Tal Voss had 4 eyes. All 4 of them were on the screen showing Danny Voss's helmet camera, which was tilted slightly now that he was sitting against the wall, showing the ceiling of the junction corridor and the distant sounds of the rest of the team moving forward to secure the area. She thought about the 9,000-page file. She thought about the clinical language and the specific dates and the letters home full of mud and cold and the smell of rain. She thought about how she had read that file and concluded, with the confidence of 40 years of experience, that it was exaggerated. She thought about Cole Harrington's quiet, tired eyes when she told him she believed his species' military reputation was probably mythologized. She thought about a 23-year-old man from a dry, hot city named Tucson. Yes, who had a dog named Biscuit and liked fishing, picking up a piece of scrap metal and walking into 3 guns to bring people home. "Does that?" she started. She stopped. She tried again. Does that happen often?" Nina did not look away from the screen. "Yeah," she said, quietly, simply, the way you say something that is just true. "Yeah, it happens." Tailvoss sat with that answer for a very long time. She mocked the myths of human warriors until she witnessed one in battle. Part 5. The Report She Sent Home. 6 months after she first stepped aboard the Ardent Cross, Tailvoss submitted her final observer report to the Varek Confederacy's combined diplomatic and intelligence offices. It was 116 pages long. Her superior, Undersecretary Vile Doss, was a methodical man who preferred written acknowledgments over calls. He had been in the office for 30 years and had reviewed hundreds of observer reports. He read them thoroughly, filed them properly, and responded to them with a standard acknowledgement note that he had refined over time to a single precise paragraph that managed to sound both warm and completely non-committal. He called her 2 days after receiving hers. "Tile," he said, in the careful tone he used when he was working out how to say something difficult. "This is not what I expected." "I know," she said. "You've described them as—" She heard the sound of pages turning. "The most functionally dangerous sapient species currently active in explored space." "That's a significant claim." "It is," she agreed. "The Council will not find it comfortable reading. Several member states have ongoing boundary negotiations with human territories. This kind of language could complicate—" "I know," she said again. "I wrote it anyway." There was a pause. Vildos had a particular quality of silence that Tailvoss had learned to read over the years. This one meant he was not going to argue with her, which meant he had read the full report, not just the summary, and something in it had settled in him the way things settle when they are simply true. "What changed your mind?" he said at last. "Your preliminary reports from the posting were measured, careful. You were skeptical when you left." She leaned back in her chair. Through her office window, the star field stretched out quiet and cold and immeasurably deep. "I was looking for the wrong things," she said. And she had thought about how to explain this for weeks. She had written it and rewritten it in the report itself, trying to get the shape of it right. The words she had eventually settled on were the ones that felt most honest, which was not always the same as the words that felt most diplomatic. "When I was given the posting," she said, "I read their military history file again. 9,000 pages. I had read parts of it before and dismissed most of it. I kept measuring them against the standard indicators: physical capability, cognitive processing speed, technological development, natural threat response. And in every category, they are average. Some categories below average. Nothing in those numbers explains what the file describes. And yet you believe the file now." "I was on the observation deck," she said. "When they responded to an attack on a civilian convoy, I watched the crew go from routine patrol to full combat deployment in 47 seconds. Not because they were given a precise order with precise instructions. Because they already knew. All of them. All at once, without needing to be told what to do. And then I watched their ship do things that ship should not be able to do, and the crew treat it as an ordinary Tuesday." "And the boarding incident," Vildos said. He had clearly read the full report. "Yes," she said quietly, "and the boarding incident." She did not describe Danny Voss again. She had described him at length in the report. She had written that section 4 times before she was satisfied with it, and she was still not entirely satisfied, because there were things that happened in that junction corridor on that raider ship that she did not think could be fully captured in any language she knew. She had written, "The individual in question was 23 years old, lightly armed, one shoulder already hit, facing 4 opponents in a defended position. The expected outcome by any rational calculation was his death, and the death of the 3 teammates he was attempting to reach. The expected outcome did not occur. When asked afterward how he had made the decision, he said he had not made a decision. He said there was nothing to decide. That last line had stayed with her more than any other single thing in her 6 months aboard the Ardent Cross. There was nothing to decide. The pattern I missed," she said to Vildos, "is not in their capabilities. It is in how they think, or more precisely, how they do not think about certain things that every other species thinks about very carefully. Meaning? Every species we know performs a survival calculation when threatened. Some do it slowly, some quickly, but everyone does it. The first question is always some version of, 'Can I survive this?' And if the answer appears to be no, behavior changes. Retreat, surrender, delay. It is not weakness, it is rational. It is what every living thing does." She paused. "Humans perform that calculation and then appear to set the result aside," she said. "When one of their own is in danger, the question they seem to be asking is not, 'Can I survive this?' It is, 'What do I do next?' And they answer that question and then they do it. And even when the first answer has already told them that what they are about to do is probably going to kill them." Vildos was quiet. "They call it different things in different parts of their culture," she continued. "Duty, loyalty, love in some contexts. None of those words quite fit from the outside. But the behavior is consistent across all their history, all their conflicts, all their cultures. It shows up in their oldest war records and in the after-action reports from last month. It does not appear to have changed or weakened over time." "That is," Vildos said carefully, "a genuinely unsettling thing to say about a species." "Yes," she agreed, "it is." She had written in the final section of her report a set of recommendations. They were not the kind of recommendations her office usually produced, and they were direct in a way that some of her colleagues would find inappropriate. She had decided she did not care. The first recommendation was simple: ally with them. Genuinely, as partners, not as strategic assets. The distinction matters to them in ways it does not matter to most species. They respond to real loyalty with something that cannot be easily described. It is not obligation or contract. It is closer to what they call love, applied outward to whoever stands beside them. It is, operationally speaking, one of the most powerful forces this observer has ever encountered in 40 years of diplomatic work. The second recommendation: do not make an enemy of them. Not out of fear, but out of understanding. They are not aggressive by nature. They do not want war. They are, in their ordinary daily lives, among the warmest and most fundamentally good-natured species this observer has encountered. They make jokes. They argue about food. They worry about their families. They name their pets things like Biscuit. But if you threaten the people they have decided to stand beside, the calculation they perform is not one you want directed at you. She had written at the end, "I arrived at this posting believing that the reputation of human warriors was a myth. I had read the evidence and concluded that no species that soft, that warm, that ordinary could become what the histories described. I was wrong. The myths are not myths. They are simply records of what these people do when the moment demands it, written by observers who, like me, could not quite believe what they were seeing until they saw it themselves." She closed the channel with Vildos and sat for a while in the quiet of her office. She thought about the Ardent Cross, out there somewhere in the Sulari zone, still running its patrols. She thought about Owen Reyes on his bridge with his tea. She thought about Gary Okafor and his 3-year-old joke and the crew members who groaned and smiled every time. She thought about Nina Caldwell sitting beside her in the secondary command room and saying, simply and without drama, "Yeah, it happens." And she thought about Danny Voss. He had recovered fully. She had checked the medical report before she filed her own. His shoulder had healed clean. He had been back on active duty within 3 weeks. The report noted, in the same dry clinical language as everything else, that the corporal had returned to full-duty status without complications and had requested no reassignment. He was still there, still on the same ship, still doing the same job. Somewhere right now, she knew, he was probably doing something completely ordinary. Eating, sleeping, telling someone about the dog back home, laughing at something. She pulled up a blank document and wrote a single line at the top, in Varek script. On the matter of human warriors, set aside all prior assessments. Begin again from the beginning. This time, believe what you read. She made herself a cup of tea, the same dark kind the humans drank, which she had developed a taste for in her months on the ship without quite noticing when it happened. Then she sat down, and she started writing the truth.